Welcome, Shannon. It's so good to have you here and so good to have all of the people who are joining us today for this wonderful webinar on a topic that is so interesting and important. So welcome, everyone. And we're talking about cybersecurity governance. And with me is Shannon Noonan, CEO and founder of HiNoon Consulting. And so many years of experience has brought us here. And I'm so excited to spend the time with you. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to this chat today.
Great. So one of the things that I would like to chat about is when it comes to cybersecurity, which again is a topic that's been getting a lot of attention and has been for a while. And the fact that we have governance, which is as well another topic that's been around for a long time. And what happens is that as we start to bring those two together, sometimes people may start to get maybe frightened by the fact that these two topics seem like they're monumental. Now, how about we begin with a quick definition and description of what it is, and then we can start looking into some of the more practical aspects of it, because I know you have a lot of those suggestions to share with us today. So how about from a definitional perspective, what are some of the key things about those two topics that can help us better get our footing when it comes to this?
Great question. Defining what governance means in your organization as well as security is key to the alignment of the business. So what does it mean to me? It means that you are meeting business requirements and needs to grow a business. But at the same time, you're meeting your compliance requirements and regulatory aspects. But as a company, defining that is defining approach, an overarching governance approach to implement and educate people throughout the organization, not just telling them what to do as a checklist.
Not only telling them what to do as a checklist. Oh, that's a tough one for auditors. Well, we have, a lot of the people who attend our webinars are people who have backgrounds in audit, compliance, and security as well. And one of the things we want to do is demystify this idea that it's all about checklists. And I did that, and then walking away, and understand that this is a very dynamic element that we're living with. And not only is it big now, it's going to continue to get big and maybe get bigger. So from that perspective, a big part of this is helping people understand that don't be afraid of cybersecurity, don't be afraid of governance, live with them and understand how there's a lot of value that we can derive from it. It is not just a cost, it is something that can also help grow the organization and enhance its value. So with that in mind, we're going to take on a more practical perspective, right? So tell us a little bit more about how we can go about, from a practical perspective, how to make this work for us.
All right. Am I diving?
Yes.
Let's dive into this.
Yes.
So as we talk about the compliance and government's key components and practices, we said it, the definition, what you have to define your approach. Mm-hmm. Overarchingly, what does that mean, right? There's so many different methods to implement. Mm-hmm. So as we go into it, I've defined it in 3 different ways, right? There's clearly many more ways, but I've broken down in my aspect into 3 categories, right? So if we go into those 3 categories, it's identifying your regulations, right? What is really important to the company. Also, what is important for security, right? Every organization has different elements that mean something. You have brand you have to worry about. You have a product you have to worry about. You have a name of the company. And I know brand and names seem to be simultaneous, but they really are not, right? You could have a brand and a name that means 2 different things to some people. Mm-hmm. And I worked for a company that did have that, right? Where they acquired an organization, and the brand of that organization had a different meaning than the name of another organization, and they tried to align them together, and they didn't have the synergies. Mm-hmm. But they also had different regulation requirements. They had different compliance needs. They had different security needs, and that also caused a mesh. So it's really identifying what that means in totality of a company, but also as you merge and acquire and evolve.
On that note, I think it's very important, and just to underscore something you said, is that this is a fluid dynamic and environment, right? So you look at it at one point in time, and there may be some reality based on what's going on at that point. But if you were to look at it maybe next week or next month or next quarter, it may be different. So that, again, begs for auditors and all compliance-minded professionals to always be aware of what's happening in the organization, to make sure we advise the organization how to make those adjustments.
Correct. And it goes into the point of, that's why they're requesting continuous risk assessments, mm-hmm. continuous monitoring. I know those words are trigger words to some people, but realistically, as part of a business, it's a need, it's a necessity. So align it to what it means to the business. If you go to acquire a business, well, what does that mean? I'm acquiring one company, they have different regulation requirements. Do I know what those mean? And how do I enhance my business and my compliance needs? Or how do I make sure there's synergies between the two?
Right, yeah.
So-
Because you don't want the business to run away too far ahead of you.
No, exactly. Otherwise, you're going to run into so many different issues. You're also going to have competing prioritizations.
That's true, yeah.
So defining the approach of how you handle compliance continuously, as well as changes happen, whether it's through acquisitions or sales of an organization.
Okay. Now, how do you manage some of this proliferation? Right? There are so many different compliance requirements in there. What do we kind of tend to do?
What do we tend to do? So for managing this, streamlining is my word. I know it's funny to say, but many people don't understand the concept of what streamlining means. You could have many compliance requirements. Well, how do you make sure it applies across the board versus having to look at it multiple times?
So if you have multiple subsidiaries or different countries or different brands and product lines and so on, then centralization.
Centralization, it's huge. So going into the centralization of all compliance requirements and making sure that there's a one-stop shop versus 55 different spots, right? You don't want to look at it over and over again. You want to look at it once and apply it across. Now, there are times that you have to look at it more than once or identify controls more than one time for the same thing, but you want to limit that as much as possible. Otherwise, it gets to be wild, wild west.
I'm thinking about two things in particular to your point. One of them has to do with the disruption to the business. And one of the things we need to remind ourselves as auditors is that what we do disrupts the business. It's a good thing that needs to happen, but they need to stop doing what they're doing to work with us during that review.
Correct.
So minimize the number of times we and other people show up is a very important thing.
Very, very much so. It is very important because at the end of the day, the business still has a job to do.
Right.
And that could be implementing an ERP solution. That could be building out a new product line. That could be acquiring another company. That could be just anything, marketing. But if you're constantly stopping the key people that have to drive those aspects of the business, their production gets delayed. So how do you work with them to align it so you don't delay them, but you're still relevant?
Right. And then the cost implication as well of that, right? Audits are not free.
Audits are not free.
So managing the budget, especially when there are tough economic times. What are the things we should be looking out for?
In regards to that, there's a few things that we should be looking at, right? Centralization, but developing a partnership. How do you develop a partnership within an organization? Because it's not one team that's doing this, right? Compliance is just an oversight. It's helping provide guidance. It's also helping implement where needed. But at the end of the day, other people are responsible for those tasks. But your boss isn't the one telling you to do that. Someone else is telling you to do that. So how do you get to become a priority? How do you become a person that is known in the organization to getting things done the right way and not just screaming, something's wrong, right? And you don't want to be that person.
So when it comes to more, let's call it more tactical activities and so on, well, one of the things that we know about is that there are a lot of frameworks out there, right? And different groups and organizations are issuing these. What are some of the thoughts regarding that?
So as we get into frameworks, right, there's a few areas I like to break it down in. One is understanding your regulatory needs. The next is really what's your customer demand? And then is your company really secure? So if we break down those different elements, regulation, what does regulation mean? These are laws that are in place. These are components that the company has to meet. So key ones that most people may or may not know is Sarbanes-Oxley is a regulation requirement. It is for anyone who's a publicly traded company. People don't think of that as cybersecurity, but it is a baseline of cybersecurity. It's related to your financial data and securing your financial data from fraudulent activities as well as other areas, right? Then you get into your HIPAA high-tech requirements. Those are laws. There's a law that you have to meet for HIPAA high-tech. CCPA, GDPR, those are your privacy laws that you have to meet. They all have a regulatory requirement. And then on the federal side, you have lots of federal laws on top of what we're already talking about, but then you've got laws to deal with in regards to doing work with just the DoD, and that's your DFARS and your FARS laws. And so you have all of these regulations, but you have to meet those and you have to make sure you're doing it. Some of them have auditors that come in regularly, like your Sarbanes-Oxley auditors. Others are periodic, like your HIPAA. So what ends up being a driver is your customer demand, which then ends up being your pipeline, your sales requests. So you'll have someone come in and say, now prove to me you're doing this. So what are they doing to prove it? They're doing a SOC 2 audit, right? And getting an attestation to show that they're being compliant. They're getting a high trust audit done to show that they're meeting the HIPAA requirements. They're doing a FedRAMP audit to show that they're meeting the NIST 800-171 requirements or the NIST 853 requirements, depending on what they're doing, right? They're going to eventually, as CMMC becomes more relevant, they're going to go get a CMMC audit done to make sure that they're meeting NIST 800-171. And PCI is a fascinating one because PCI is a regulatory requirement, but it is also a self-assessment and audit. So you have a QSA come in and do your audit on PCI. So it's a requirement that you have to do. So it's an interesting perspective, but it's driven by usually a contract demand or a customer that says, show me that you're doing this, because they have something they have to meet and they have to rely on your business to also meet those demands and needs.
The way you present it, I like the way you did it, because part of the challenge here in some cases, and when we started, part of what my comment was that we see it as a compliance exercise, right, and a checklist exercise of some kind. However, the way you presented it, it talks a bit in terms of the business and the revenue you're going to get as a result of these relationships and these products that you're selling and those partners you build and the vendors you have and your customers you have. So if we were to reframe our thinking and think of it as a value creator, and if we were to think of it as something that if we do it right now, we can get this business. And if we continue doing it, we can get additional business and the word will get around that we are a good company to work with. It can really help sustain and elevate the business. So if we were to reframe it that way, I think it'll certainly get a lot of good attention, good traction.
It definitely does, but it also falls into the category of check the box activities because people just get a SOC 2 right now. To get a SOC 2 to check that box to say that they did it. Now, are they getting a SOC 2 by a good auditor? Are they getting a SOC 2 and covering all the right controls? Because if you have a SOC 2 report that only has, say, confidentiality and availability in the report, would you take that showing that you've got security? Right? So you really have to look at these reports other than seeing on the line that says it passed.
Okay.
Right? So you really got to look at this details and say, do I truly have what's my company posture? Am I truly secure? But also as an organization looking into somebody else's window, I want to know that you're secure, right? And sometimes you have check the box activities that say, yep, if I do these 5 things, I know the auditor is going to say I pass. But does that truly mean you're secure when it's only looking at a scope this big and your whole environment is so much bigger?
Right.
Right. So we got to, as a company, yes, apply and look at these different security requirements and regulation requirements, but you got to look at it from a totality of a company. So that's where a framework comes in and says, let me look at these frameworks, but don't just apply it to the small scope that you want to apply it to. You should be applying it across the company and develop a process that is robust enough that could be applied across the company.
Great advice. Great advice. So let's do something now in terms of engaging with our audience. So how about we have a polling question, and you should be seeing it at the moment. What is a regulatory requirement? And we have 3 options here: Sarbanes-Oxley, SOC 2, and high trust. So we'll give you a few seconds to respond to it. And then just so you know, as part of getting your CPE for attending today's session, you need to respond to these questions. So we're going to have several of them. Please respond to them. And serves 2 purposes. Number 1, makes you eligible for CPE, of course. But number 2, so we can hear from you as well. And we can confirm some of our understanding about what we're talking about. So what is a regulatory requirement? Sarbanes-Oxley, SOC 2, high trust. We will give you a few seconds to respond to that. Okay, very well. So thank you for participating and for answering those questions. And as soon as we get the details on your responses, we will chat a little bit about those. But Shannon, how about we get a head start on that and tell us a little bit about the responses there? Most people have already recorded their answers. So which is the correct answer on this question?
The correct answer on this question is Sarbanes-Oxley. And really want people to understand what is a regulatory requirement. Sarbanes-Oxley is a regulatory requirement for publicly traded companies. SOC 2 is an attestation that you go and get an assessment of your organization so you can provide it to your customers. And HITRUST is a third-party assessment of your environment to meet the HIPAA high-tech regulations. So a lot of your hospitals or anyone that has to meet the HIPAA regulations, that's what they would look for to be done.
So we have some responses, and we're looking at 60 indicating Sarbanes-Oxley. And we have 33% saying SOC 2, and then we have HITRUST 7. So Sarbanes-Oxley, what you said, correct?
Correct. That's what I said.
The vast majority of people got that one correctly. So so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to Sarbanes-Oxley, just a quick aside as far as that goes. not an aside, really, because we're going to come back to it. But it's interesting because when people talk about Sarbanes-Oxley, they say, oh, Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2000 and when?
Yeah.
2002. We're talking over 20 years now. But it's still relevant. And it's something to always remember is the fact that some of these regulations are around for a long time. I mean, there are certain laws that were written back in the 30s in terms of securities laws, right?
Correct.
So these things have a long life, and we have to understand also why they were put in place. And one of the things that I have found very helpful is explain to people why the regulations and why the laws and rules are in place. And in many cases, it was because something terrible happened right before it, and we are trying to correct for it.
Correct.
So, we can get into an argument or debate as to whether or not it's a good or not, or goes far enough or doesn't, and so on. But at the end of the day, these things are put in place because something happened that was very much damaging to value creation and preservation in organizations and investors in general as well. And we need to be mindful about that. And this is an example of that. So Sarbanes-Oxley is alive and well. And in fact, the PCOB is looking at that and making some suggestions on how to even strengthen it.
Correct.
Because we have challenges even 21 years later.
Yes, we do. And people forget that Sarbanes-Oxley is security at the end of the day. It's all this. It's the baseline of a security control framework and regulation requirement.
Yeah. So as we're taking a look at some of these things, so we spoke a bit about frameworks. So how about that second thing you mentioned about centralization? Because we have such a proliferation of frameworks and rules, regulations, and we have also a lot of software packages and people selling you things, right? One of the things that I learned early in my career was if you have a process problem, don't just buy software because it's not going to solve your problem.
It doesn't take, yes, it
don't
does
sell
not.
salespeople, right? They're still going to try to sell you on it, but we have to be smart shoppers. But when it comes to centralization, what are some of the key things we need to know about that, considering the universe of rules, regulations, and requirements and expectations? What can we do?
Right. And centralization has many meanings to people. For me, centralization on compliance is really being the quarterback of the company, bringing everything into one spot so that you have one group, one voice, one meaning. Now, you might be getting lots of voices from the outside, but you have one person radioing that out to the company, right? So people understand what's required and how to do it.
I'm sorry, one thing there too, though, it's within a key department, and I'm thinking about ownership.
Yes.
So it's one of those things where previously we were talking about how important it is for all of us to understand and appreciate it, but there's got to be ownership.
Somebody has to own it. Yeah,
well.
I'm advocating you've got to own it, right? If you have your compliance requirements broken down into many different teams, right? So great example is finance usually owns SOX, right? Your finance team owns SOX. Then you have a security team that may own FedRAMP. And then you have a security team that owns SOC 2. And then you have the federal team own this. Well, why are we doing it all these different ways? Why not bring it into a centralized place? Have one team quarterback it and make sure all of the business is doing what they need to do. That helps with also getting the buy-in of the top-down approach, right? So getting people from your management to understand the message that they need to promote, because when they see everything centralized, they sit there and say, oh my gosh, we have a lot of work going on here, a lot of requirements, and our teams are overwhelmed. So one, it might help with getting more overhead because you're spending hundreds and thousands of hours on compliance needs. So it shows that you need extra heads, but it also really proves that if the top down buys into this, it's going to get prioritized, and it's not going to be a check the box activity. So when you get prioritization and you build into the business needs and the business functions, you're going to have someone else helping you get this done, even though you're pushing it through the door.
Yeah, I'm also thinking in terms of the consistency as well. So one of the things that sometimes we run into as auditors, and I mean, I use the word auditors broadly, talking about compliance. I sometimes use the expression, I kind of coined it myself, the compliance-minded professionals, right? But even that is limited because we do advisory services. But anyway, but one of the key things that we're looking for is, and the organization benefits from some consistency, so that if you're talking about what templates are you using, how are you documenting these things, right? And on the other side, if you're going to buy services or products, you also have the benefit of being able to look at it from that perspective. So having that consistency allows you to do comparisons, benchmarking, and be able to identify a weakness and say, okay, if we fix it here, it's going to trickle down throughout the whole organization. So there's an economy of scale.
Yes. No, and it goes into the streamlining impact. So, right, yes, you can benchmark, you can do all these different aspects, but a tool doesn't make a process happen. You have a lot of these tools out there that say that you can be compliant if you use our tool. Yes and no. A tool can go in and show you what some of your environment is in regards to configuration. It cannot make sure that you're doing your SDLC process. It cannot make sure that you're adding and removing users properly. It cannot make sure that you're addressing your vulnerabilities based off of the vulnerability scan. It can tell you something's there, but it can't fix it for you. So it really comes down to, as you use tools such as whether it's a control tool that tells you here's all the controls that apply to all these different compliance requirements you have in an organization, or a tool that sits there and say, hey, you're not meeting your password requirements over here. Well, now who's going to take that, pick it up, and fix it? Who's going to finish it? Who's going to make sure you've streamlined it and you don't have someone doing something over here to meet your FedRAMP compliance and then someone over here meeting your SOX compliance? And then you have something in the middle doing GDPR because nobody understands privacy and why it needs to get done. So everyone just like runs away from it and say, okay, legal, just you deal with it. And so nobody really does it. So how do you handle that? You've got to streamline it and take advantage of what the tools offer you. And through a centralized approach, you can take advantage of those tools, that message, and then implement a process across the company to apply it to someone's job. So you can build it into someone's job. Oh, someone's already looking at vulnerability scans. Well, now they have a dashboard that tells them in a better way. Okay, that's great. I have controls that need to be done. I can see the control framework and I can say, all right, this control applies to these 5 different areas. How do we make it a one-stop shop, that it's one configuration across all the 5 different areas versus one to meet FedRAMP, one to meet Sarbanes-Oxley, one to meet PCI, one to meet CMMC, one to meet HIPAA High Trust? You don't need to do that. Figure out what your baseline is and what the benchmark is that you want and run with it. Determine what the floor is for the company, right? Same on privacy. What's the floor? Are you global? Okay, so does that mean that everywhere has to apply to GDPR versus some organizations like to say, well, I don't want to apply that across the board. But you don't know what's going to happen. What happens if all of a sudden you get a new customer that's classified as a US and they're only meeting US, but there's a global instance, and all of a sudden you've got Asia data and European data in your environment, it's only meeting Texas privacy laws, if there's even Texas privacy laws.
Yeah, but yeah, we have different states that are requesting and requiring certain things. So that's a very important point in terms of having that centralized reporting, because I'm sure that the board will also appreciate that, or the compliance committee will appreciate having a report that's going to summarize everything, as opposed to getting a proliferation of reports that they cannot really easily compare to each other.
It gets lost because unless someone demands to see it, or someone's coming in and audit it frequently, those items get lost. So you have your FedRAMP audits that have to happen every year to maintain your FedRAMP certification or attestation, right? You have a SOX audit that has to happen every year so that you can just do your filings. You have all of these items. SOC 2 is done every year. So what are the ones that aren't done all the time?
Yeah.
Right? So even like PCI is a great example. It is a regulatory requirement by the credit card companies that you have to do this if you're doing any credit card transactions.
Right.
Now there's different levels, right? If you are high volume credit card user or processor, then you have to file with the Visa, MasterCard companies, and you need a QSA to come in and do their audits. It's not a framework, though, but it aligns with frameworks. It has all the different pieces of what a framework would be. So if you're meeting a PCI requirement in your environment in totality, you'd be great. But at the end of the day, it's really not a framework. And a lot of people only apply PCI to the very small environment that's PCI. It's segmented, and we say this is what PCI is. They don't apply it across the board.
Great opportunity for people to make some enhancements.
Exactly.
So a couple of things. So to those who are joining us today, a couple of things to remind you of. Number one, if you have a question, you can go ahead and you can submit your question through the chat box, and we will definitely address those during the QA session later on in today's presentation. But before that, let's take a look at another polling question. So the question reads, what is not a framework? COBIT, ISO 27001, or PCI? So what is not a framework? COBIT, ISO 27001, or PCI? I'm going to give you a few seconds to record your answers, and then we'll talk about them in a moment. Okay, so as the last responses get collected and we comment on the results, so what is the correct answer?
The correct answer is C. PCI is not a framework. For many people think it is a framework. It's a regulatory, it's a requirement, right? So COBIT is a framework. ISO 27000 is a framework as well as an audit that most international companies, and PCI is a requirement for your credit card processing.
Okay, so PCI, correct?
PCI.
All right. Well, you'll be pleased to hear that roughly 2/3 of the viewers today answered that one correctly. So those of you who answered COBIT or ISO 27001, those are not the correct answers, but PCI is. So just wanted to share that feedback back to everyone. So as we're looking at the material that we're talking about, then as we're talking about cybersecurity and governance. And there's so many things to it, of course, right? But let's take a look at one of the key things that are also going to be important to us, and that is how we interact with others, because no one can do cybersecurity alone.
No.
So that being the case and understanding that constraint, what are some of the things that we need to know about this?
So this is where the third area that I like to talk about is your partnerships. How do you partner with other organizations to make sure you are getting what you need to done for security and for compliance, right? So there's key areas in a partnership, and I'll highlight the key areas and we can go more in depth, but legal, CIO, CISO, security. So I'm looking at it from the perspective of a compliance leader and of the business. So your CFOs and your CIOs, which sometimes people don't even think of to go and talk to, right? But if you start with legal is a lot of times the one defining or interpreting the regulatory requirements. So what do you need to do from a definition? So they take the law and they interpret it for us. So we can then say, all right, how do I take that interpretation and apply it to the company? So a lot of times it's, are we meeting contractual requirements? They interpret that contractual requirement, and then we go forth and help implement. I've worked with many organizations on the legal aspect side where we're partners, we're aligned, but I've helped them implement privacy programs. I've helped them implement HIPAA high-tech requirements, right? And that can sometimes be difficult because half the time they're the ones that become responsible for privacy and HIPAA and high-tech because nobody wants to touch it. Even though it's the security, the CISO, the CFO, and the CIO, people or individuals who own that data, own that information. So working with the CISO and security, I always look at it as my best friend in an organization when it comes to compliance tends to be security. And it has nothing to do with, like, I'm not friends with everyone else, but it has to do with they own a lot of implementing of the controls that I need in place. They're the responsible parties for getting it done. So my partnership and alignment, and also getting them to have the top-down approach of communicating with me, is very greatly beneficial. And with us being aligned as one team, we can communicate the same message across the board, right? So same with legal, right? It's almost like we're the triad, because sometimes we're all looked at very oddly because we own different aspects of the compliance and contractual requirements. So if we teamed up properly together and we all interpreted, all understood the message together, created one team to implement that and align each other, well, it's going to be easier now. We can all go talk to the CFO and CIO together, right? Because the CFO usually owns the purse strings of the company. So if you need more budget, you've got to usually go explain to them why you need more budget. Or if something's changing, you usually have to explain to the CFO as well as COO and CEO. But a lot of times you start with the CFO because they're the individuals that have to find the money if we need it. And your CIOs, because your CIOs own the environments at the end of the day. So if you need something done for some application, you're usually going to your CIO and say, I need something done for this application to meet X, Y, and Z. I need them to buy off to make sure it's a prioritization. If they don't buy off on it, it's going on the bottom of the totem pole and may never get seen. Because these teams have so much work on their plate, right? So much work. So if we are not a partner with all these different areas, you're going to get bottleneck and you're not going to get any movement. So you have to be looked at as a priority to them to meeting business needs. So if you're on their agenda as a priority, then somehow you're meeting some business function or business need that they also have to meet. So how do you align that? It's through partnerships.
And one of the things that comes to mind as well as you're describing this is the importance of being able to articulate why this is the case, right? In many cases, what will happen is that they may, and I'm not saying that they do or don't or how often it happens, but in my experience, I have been in situations where they'll look at it and they'll ask it from the perspective of what's the least that I need to do just to comply. And we need to help them understand that it's not just a minimalist approach. We don't want to just waste money either.
Correct.
But we need to be able to articulate why the cheapest solution or the most expedient one is not necessarily the best one, not just in the short term, but perhaps even in the medium term and longer term. So we need to be able to articulate what we need, why we need it, and what's the value proposition behind it. So do you have any experience as far as that? You kind of chuckled a little bit when I said that. So I have a feeling that you've been there.
I have a lot of experience with this. It's also understanding the different languages the business talks, right? That's one aspect of this is everyone communicates differently on what their needs and their wants are. So how do you fit into that mold of what the needs and wants are of each organization? And I'm trying to think of a great example of what I've done in regards to working with the different leaderships.
Well, that's okay. One of the things we can do while you're thinking about that, and that's okay. So we need to ask a couple of questions, right? So we have two things. I ask the audience, once again, if you have any questions, make sure you write it and put it into the chat box, and we'll address it during the QA section of the program today. But secondly, we have our polling question. So who is a key partner for compliance? We have the CISO and /security. We have the legal department or unit. We have the CIO, and then D, all of the above. So who is a key partner for compliance? Okay, very well. So while we collect the last responses and we aggregate those, so we have these four options, right? Who is a key partner for compliance? CISO/security, legal, CIO, all of the above. I'm going to go on a limb and say all of the above.
Correct.
All of the above. Okay. So we have the responses coming in here. Let's take a quick look. And we have, well, let's start with the largest number that I see, and that's 88% saying all of the above. So they have been paying attention, which is fantastic. A few said, indicated the other ones, but just a very small number of individuals. But yes, all of the above. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, is the fact that all of them play an important role, whether it is just strictly security, whether it is on the legal and the contractual side. And by the way, when it comes to that, there are times when a comma, a semicolon, one word can really expand the understanding and definition or the coverage of a particular item, or if in its absence, it can be a loophole that can be very problematic as well. And in my experience, legal can become a very important partner to make sure that as much as you try to be thorough, that you don't miss something. And similarly, different trends in the profession where it may be that now the insurance companies are basically asking for something else, and they say, okay, in the future, your contract should also include a clause regarding this. Legal can be your helper when it comes to that. And we talk about the right to audit and so on. If it's not in your contract, chances are you're not going to go very far. So again, legal can be your helper here, and the CIO and the CISO square. So anyway, let's go back to we were talking earlier about experiences as regards to working with some of these different groups and how they've been able to support what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so in essence, I've had a lot of great experience with all these different companies. I'm actually working with an organization where the CFO has been a tremendous help. And it's because they're supporting us from a budget perspective. So we have to go in and explain to them the needs, the wants that we have, and how it aligns to the business. Because he needs to go find the dollars and cents and explain to the CEO and CIO why the budget has to go up outside of the budget period. So if we go in with clarity of what we need, it's very helpful. But if we also go into communicating his language or her language, it's tremendous because now they can apply what we need into a business perspective. Legal's always a great person to partner with. One, because they have a lot of needs too that need to get done. They're the ones on the hook when it comes to privacy requirements. They're on the hook for HIPAA requirements. They're on the hook for the contract requirements. So if they have a true partnership with somebody helping them implement that into the organization, taking those contractual requirements and implementing it or making sure it's getting done, that is tremendous. And security and CISO, they always need somebody that's helping them. Not in a way technically, but in a way to partner with them because they always need somebody. And I've worked with great security teams. And I, like I said, they're usually my best friend because at the end of the day, CISO tends to own the SOC 2. For some reason, the CISO tends to own the SOC 2 at making sure it gets done. So when they have a compliance arm that can help them get it done and knows how to partner with all the different teams and get it to be part of their day-to-day jobs. Like I said, I usually only own a team of 3 to 5 people. Mm-hmm. That's not getting all these compliance needs. I need to partner with the engineering group to make sure that they're building in what I need to the product. I need to work with the IT CIO group to make sure that I have configuration set properly. I need to work with security to make sure that the vulnerability scans are being run in the environment, so on and so forth, right? And then when it comes to data, I've got to work with the CFO on the financial data. I've got to work with the IT department on personal data and HIPAA data, right? Because we need to know where all of it is. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones who know the behind the scenes pieces, whereas the people on the front end can say, hey, I use this application to do this, this, and this. Now, where is it hiding? Mm-hmm. Right? So if you work with each of these teams and you help them understand why you have to get it done and also help develop the process of getting your compliance needs met, it's going to make night and day. Mm-hmm.
And a couple of things that come to mind as well as you're describing this, and I'm thinking about one of the first thing that people recommend is having this inventory, right, of data. And you just mentioned the fact that people can have this data just stored in all different places. Mm-hmm. And how will I know? So we need to go and talk to these other parties, right? These other individuals will help us understand where they're holding data, how long they're keeping it for, how they're doing backups, how they're getting rid of it when it comes to the end of the life of that piece of data. So all of these things are important for us to know, and we will not know it on our own. That's why we need to partner. So that becomes very, very important as well. So as we're thinking about these two key words, right? Very hot words, cybersecurity and governance. Any last remarks before we go into the QA section?
So really my last mark is define. Define your governance and security approach. I always tell people align it with the business. Mm-hmm. You need to align, and people may think I'm crazy or I don't make any sense. But if you align what your needs are from a governance and security perspective to the business needs, it becomes an agenda for your boards, for your investors. It becomes a prioritization for the company. So it's not just the scary word of security, which it's a fascinating because the formal definition of security is protection from or resilience against potential harm caused by others. That's a scary definition at the end of the day, right? Who are you worried about harming you? Because that's what security and compliance do. I'm preventing you from something bad happening. Well, nobody really wants to handle that. So how do you align that message and that communication style so that it's aligned to the business? So now you're governing all the company versus just a small box.
Mm-hmm. And when we're thinking about the many constituents that we serve, right, we have, and we quite often default to employees. And one of the things that I try to advocate for as well is when you're talking about contractors who have access to data, when you have vendors and customers who have access to data and proprietary information and so on, we need to make sure we are extending a lot of these governance topics to them as well, so that they're getting trained, they are understanding their responsibility as they are creating, using, and then transmitting any kind of data or records. And this is something that is not to be held, in a tight grip by one individual. It is everybody's job.
Everybody's job.
And when we say everybody, it's not just all employees, right? Is making sure we understand all the different people who touch it at one point or another. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
So as we continue our program today, we want you to hear from you as well. So if you have not yet asked your question, please go ahead and do so. We're seeing some questions coming in, which is fantastic. We're looking forward to answering those questions. So send them in and we will address them. So let's take a look at the first question. And Brian is basically asking us to give us an example of a time when you partnered with legal and security.
My whole career.
Okay.
No, but true example. Before I owned a company of my own, I was the compliance head of compliance for a global organization. And I had to work with legal and security to implement many programs. We were working in Asia, Europe, South America, as well as the US. And all of the countries have different requirements. So we have controls that we meet on the security layer, and we're applying it across the board. But I have different regulations in regards to data and how you secure it, where it's stored, who's responsible for it. So for legal, I worked with legal who would help partner me with a legal entity in Singapore. I literally worked with lawyers at 10 o'clock at night in Singapore because I needed them to tell me the regulations and the laws of Singapore so I could implement across the company, because we were implementing it in the US and applying across the world. So same thing with, there's regulation requirements about doing data or doing jobs in, say, South America. Some of it has to be, the sales documentation has to be put into a specific language, right? There's the same thing in Japan. There's specific documentation that has to be in a specific language. So do you know that? Well, you don't if you don't partner with the right team. So legal is a great partnership because they can help find, one, the legal entities that you need to work with to get interpretation so you can apply it. Security, I've said this a few times now, right? They're your biggest partner because they need you half the time to help drive their message, because a lot of times security has a scary agenda, right? They have to meet certain requirements and they have to make sure that nothing's bad's happening to the company. So a lot of times we have synergies in the sense of communicating the same message. So partnering with the security team and saying, this is what I need. How does that lay onto what you need? And then let's go communicate at the same time so that we can both get our agendas done and prioritize it in the company.
Great. Thank you very much. That's been very helpful to understand that. Okay, so let's take a look at another question. And this one is from Sandra. There are so many frameworks. Do you have any advice on how to streamline them so they are more manageable?
So there's tools out there. There's lots of options. So you can use a tool, you can use a spreadsheet, you can do many things. But beyond just using a tool, I would sit there and say you need to identify, one, the frameworks that apply to you. Are you doing federal work? Are you working internationally? Do you have regulation requirements, right? So if you're working internationally, most times you need to apply ISO 27001 because they're familiar with that framework, just like SOC 2 is very familiar here in the US. If you are working with the federal government, you're going to be doing something around NIST 800, whether it's NIST 800 171, NIST 853, you name it, whatever NIST program, right? So identify what that is, and then identify how to streamline it. So the controls may have a different language or may go into incremental details, but control is a control is a control. You just have to interpret the control once and apply across many. So if your password parameters say you need to do something for X, Y, and Z, figure out which one has the more rigor and apply it across all the frameworks, because the base is whatever you define it as. So if you go with the more rigor of the control requirement, then you can apply it across the others. The others are not going to be upset that you had more rigor, right? So look at it from that way. Same thing, I like to say, user access review is a great one. I know vulnerability scans are other ones, but user access review is my favorite. So you have some frameworks that say you got to do it every 30 days. You have some frameworks that say you have to do it quarterly. So really define what it makes sense. So what's the risk? And apply it properly. If you're doing PCI, you have to do it quarterly. Well, guess what? That's your base. Because if you're a PCI environment, you're going to do a user access review quarterly, right? Whereas Sarbanes-Oxley says you have to do it periodically. You've got to define that. But if you don't know what those are, you can't streamline it across many.
Great advice, because in some cases people feel like they are overwhelmed or they get lost in the requirements, right? But there's a way to go about it, so that's very helpful. So let's take a look at the next question. This one is from Evans. Due to the rapid growth of cybercrime, what are the countermeasures for that? Also, with integration of AI in cybersecurity, will it get worse? What do you think?
This is a very complicated question. There's not really one answer. A lot of this is going to be education, because at the end of the day, if somebody wants to get into your environment, they're going to get in. And that sounds scarier. And as a professional, am I really opening myself up to that? If they want to be in your environment, they'll figure out how to get into it. And they're going to get into it through a person, whether it's a phishing attempt. They're going to find somebody that's going to click that link and open that file that's going to get them in. Now, what do? We educate, we train. Now we have technological preventative capabilities. So if you find something, you can contain it and hold it into a box, right? But that's why we do so many different avenues. That's why we have layers, right? Not everyone likes to say layers in defense, but that's why it's there, is so that you have VPN, you have networking that makes sure that certain things are not getting through. You have antivirus on your computer to help prevent, if you open up a file that has some type of malware, prevent it from going anywhere, so on and so forth, right? So you really got to look at what your environment has and it's implemented. Is it going to get worse with AI? I don't think any of us truly know what is going to happen with AI, because the more we have AI, the more automation is going to happen, the more process is going to be simplified. And some people are going to forget that it's not everything that's going to happen. So AI doesn't mean you have to get rid of everything else around you. It just means you have to move with AI, and that's what technology does. So you need to identify, are you using the right tools or are you using outdated tools, right? So all of us look at our computers. You probably update your computer every 3 years. Well, why are you not doing the same with your technology? Why are you not staying with the time? So organizations should be looking at the technology they have and saying, is it still the right tool? It was 3 years ago. Is it still the right tool today to meet the demand of what AI as well as other cybersecurity risks are recreating for us in the environment? And that's really what you got to do. It's a constant. It's continuous.
Okay. No, this is very important, and this is a good segue for the next question, which is from, it doesn't have a name, it just says YouTube, but it's a very important question because it's talking about from the perspective of someone who's new to this field, right? So how can a newbie get work into governance, understanding just how fluid it is, how much growth potential there is, and so on? Well, if I am starting out, what do I need to do? So just a few tips for
Welcome to governance is what I'll say.
Yes.
There is tons of work out there for governance. What do you need to do? You need to get educated. You need to understand what frameworks are. You need to understand controls. And you need to be willing to dive into the robust environments. So it doesn't mean you're an expert. Day one, you are not an expert, right? And the teams know that. So when you're new to it, they know you're new to this, so they will do the training, but they want to see that you're willing to learn and willing to ask questions, right? I take newbies all day long because I love training people in what I do. And that's because I love giving them the experiences I've had. I like experts too. Don't get me wrong. I like it both people, right? But newbie, there's something about them that when they're excited and they want to learn, they're going to dive into it. So just be willing to learn and suck everything up like a sponge.
Okay, very good. Well, the next question is similar to it. Can someone get into IT auditing and governance compliance without IT experience?
Yes, and I am a great example of that. I actually started out as an accountant. I did not start out in IT, and I was getting my master's in IT, and I was working for a large $50 billion company at the time doing financial and operational audits. And I decided to go get an IT degree. And the IT audit director found out and said, now you're an IT auditor. And I jokingly said, how do you turn on a computer? Because I didn't know anything about IT audits at the time. I didn't even know what I was doing. I had to learn about Unix. I had to learn about databases. They put me on a mainframe audit, which some of you on this call may not even know what a mainframe is, but they still exist. And what I literally would sit with someone in the morning and they would tell me, here's what I need you to do. I would ask a million questions. I would go off and do my work, and I would sit with them in the afternoon to go through it. Now, not everyone has that ability, but I will say is learn by asking questions. Don't just take the documentation that you've seen, because in IT audits, as well as other audits, a lot of people will say, hey, here's documentation from last year. As long as it mirrors this, you're good for this year. Ask the question of what that is. What does that document say to you? Understand it, interpret it. That's going to be where you're going to be the next person to progress and go to those next levels. But I would say anyone can get into IT audits if you're willing to learn. It is complicated, but you can simplify it by just understanding that you're not going to know everything right off the bat, and you just have to learn and ask a lot of questions.
Okay, great advice, because sometimes we feel overwhelmed by it, but it is doable. You did it, I've done it. It is doable.
Yeah.
We have a question. This is from Stanley. What is the most effective approach to implementing a revised framework? Example, ISO 2701, 2022, so very recent, if the organization has not fully adopted it yet.
So you need to understand what you've got in place versus what you don't. So a lot of organizations that are implementing the new frameworks, right, they will get an assessment of what has changed, right? So if they already have it implemented, they'll say what has changed, and then they go and identify, do they have a process in place for the change? If they have not implemented fully, it's the same, right? You need to know what has changed. Does that impact what you've already implemented, and do you have to change anything or update it? I like to use the word enhancement, because if they're changing a framework, it's enhancing. So it's just trying to figure out how to improve upon what you currently have. So you would then, it's almost doing a mini gap assessment. Do you meet that requirement? Is there a better way to do it? And if not, what's the recommendation? If you meet the requirement, you've done your mini gap assessment, you've explained why you meet it, and you know what to do. But you really need to identify what the difference is and how it impacts you.
Okay, great. And the gap assessment, gap analysis is definitely a very important tool, and it's a good place to start. And you don't feel overwhelmed, right? It's something you can do. You acknowledge what you have, what you need to do, and it gives you a bit of a roadmap to go forward. So the next question is from James. Which is more important to be implemented and effective, cyber policies or cyber controls?
They're the same. They're the same. So policies, a lot of times policies are generic to some companies. Some companies do get into specifics. Cyber control should be realistically repeating what your policies say, right? Your controls should align to your policies, and as well as your procedures. So some people really will say cyber policy and procedures. A lot of times policies are a high-level overview of what you should be doing. Your procedures are usually your details. Your controls should always align with your policies and procedures. If they don't align, then something's off. Either your controls are not being met, not applicable, or you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Very important thing to be mindful of, because sometimes when we look at these disconnects, right? And the question, well, what's happening? Why do we get to this point? That is a very important thing to keep in mind. So thank you very much. So we have a question, and this has to do with implementation of that quarterback concept that you shared earlier. So what does it take to implement quarterback compliance, considering the shortage of resources in the cybersecurity sector?
That's a great question. That is why I have a company, to be honest with you. So what does it take? It takes a lot of patience, because it's not easy collecting all of the compliance needs, because some people will be fearful if you take it away from them and centralize it, their purpose and meaning for the company is gone. Whereas it's not taking it away from them, it's saying, hey, we're centralizing and putting it in one spot. You can still be the owner of this. We're just going to have one message come from one team. So what will it take? I've worked with many organizations doing this. To be honest with you, a lot of times what I do is I work with the different leaders and then different organizations, and I say, let me help you manage this. Let me help you get to the finish line. Because what I want to do is I want to see all of the different compliance requirements we have to do and figure out how we can streamline it so that instead of having many audits, maybe we have one audit that covers multiple aspects, or we can use one set of evidence for multiple audits, right? There's different ways to go about it, but it's all about working and communicating with those team leaders to say, let's bring it into one area so that we can streamline, enhance, and it also have one business message versus if this director is going for it for this way and that director is doing it for this way and that one, the teams that are responsible for doing this work's heads are going to spin because too many people are telling them how to do it and nothing gets done.
Mm-hmm. So we have time for one more question, and this has to do with the relationship between Sarbanes-Oxley and ITGCs, right? We've heard that term many times before, but what is the relation between the two? Are they the same? Are they different? How do they cross over?
So that's a really interesting question, interesting point of view. So Sarbanes-Oxley is the regulation requirement. You are working to meet and secure financial data from all the bad, right? You can blame the Enrons of the world for this one. Mm-hmm. So, and MCI, right? There's a few issues. Anyhow, but ITGCs is a component of SOX, right? It's your IT general controls. So it's making sure that the controls for your systems are being met for IT, right? So finance has their controls, which is usually around the business process and how they're securing and making sure the financial data is not fraudulent or has any inappropriateness. You're doing it the same on the IT side. So ITGCs is just a piece of SOX. So it's making sure you've got change management controls in place. How are you implementing and developing code and configuration changes? It's making sure you've got user access controls in place. How are you making sure that all the right people have access to the right data and how they're authorized to get to that data? And then it's around your operational controls, right? How are we making sure that job scheduling is happening and what tools you're using? So if you need data to go from one system to the next, how is that being done and how is it secure? So at the end of the day, they're one and the same. SOX is the regulation. ITGC is just a component of it.
Great. Thank you very much for helping us better understand that. Sometimes we get lost in all the acronyms and the letters and also understanding the source or the origin of these things, right? Why does it matter? So Shannon, thank you so much. We'll appreciate your sharing all of these insights with us and helping us better understand how cybersecurity and governance are interrelated and how we can look at those things as a way of not only helping to protect, but also to enhance and create value for organizations in a manageable way. So thank you very much for sharing those thoughts with us.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.